How could a night meant for celebration turn into a scene that no one could have imagined? How does a family, seemingly ordinary, descend into an unimaginable tragedy in the space of a few hours? For fans of Hollywood icon Rob Reiner and his beloved wife Michelle, the answer came too late, in a revelation so shocking that it left their entire community and the world reeling. On a quiet Sunday morning, their daughter Romy discovered what no one ever wants to see. Her parents, lifeless, the result of multiple sharp force injuries. The official ruling from the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner confirmed what the scene already suggested: homicide. Rob Reiner, a legendary figure in the film world, aged 78, and Michelle, his partner for decades, aged 70, were gone. But what made the story even more chilling was the timeline leading up to this nightmare. The explosive confrontation hours earlier at a festive holiday gathering, and the involvement of someone they had loved most, their son, Nick. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It's a story that seems ripped from the pages of a thriller, yet every detail is painfully real. And what makes it even more terrifying is that beneath the veneer of normalcy, smiles, family photos, Hollywood glamour, lay tensions that escalated to a breaking point no one saw coming. For those who followed the Reiners' lives, Rob's decades in Hollywood, his celebrated career as a director and actor, and Michelle's quiet yet firm presence beside him, this was unfathomable. How could this family, admired by so many, fall into such horror within the confines of their own home? To understand the gravity, one must rewind to the last moments Rob and Michelle were seen alive. They attended what should have been a joyous occasion: Conan O'Brien's annual holiday party, a gathering known for laughter, camaraderie, and holiday cheer. From the outside, it looked like a night of warmth and celebration, an opportunity for friends and colleagues to exchange greetings, reminisce, and toast the season. But according to eyewitnesses, the atmosphere was far from jovial. Those close to the family later revealed an argument, sharp words exchanged between Rob, Michelle, and their son Nick, a confrontation that, in hindsight, appeared to foreshadow the tragedy that would soon unfold. What makes this story so compelling and so horrifying is the contrast between public perception and private reality. The Reiners were, to all appearances, the epitome of a successful, loving family. Rob's legacy in film, both in front of and behind the camera, was monumental. Michelle's steady presence, her support, and the life they built together painted the image of a life many could only admire from afar. And yet, behind closed doors, tensions simmered, arguments erupted, and the dynamics between parent and child were fraught with conflict. How could the man who guided generations of actors and directed some of Hollywood's most iconic films, and the woman who shared his life for decades, meet such a violent end in their own home? This is where the story becomes even more chilling. The discovery of their bodies by their daughter Romy is itself a moment that no one could easily process. Imagine walking into the place where you grew up, the home where laughter and warmth once filled every corner, only to find the unimaginable. Romy's horror, her shock, her grief, all unfolded in real time as emergency responders arrived. The neighborhood began to murmur, and the news would eventually reach the world. It's a scene that has haunted fans and observers alike, forcing questions that have no easy answers. How did it happen? Why? And most importantly, could it have been prevented? As the hours passed and authorities began their investigation, the autopsy report would reveal details that both confirmed and deepened the horror. The phrase multiple sharp force injuries sounds clinical, detached, but behind it lies a reality that is anything but. A violent attack, deliberate and fatal, ending the lives of two people who had built decades together. The method, the timing, the circumstances, each element would be dissected, analyzed, and debated. And yet, the report alone cannot fully capture the emotional magnitude of what transpired. For friends, family, fans, and even casual observers, the human element, the shock, the grief, the disbelief, is inseparable from the cold facts. And then there is the question that everyone wants answered. The role of Nick, the son. Reports indicate that he was involved in an argument with his parents at the holiday party. Witnesses described the confrontation as explosive, one that revealed long-standing tensions and resentments. But how does a disagreement, however heated, escalate to homicide within hours? What broke the barrier between a heated family argument and a tragic, irreversible act? These are the questions that grip the imagination and refuse to let go, forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about family, loyalty, anger, and human behavior. This story also raises broader questions about perception versus reality. In the public eye, Hollywood families are often idealized. They live lives that seem glamorous, full of laughter, success, and prestige. Yet behind the scenes, they are subject to the same pressures, conflicts, and emotional struggles as any other family. Rob Reiner, for all his public persona and accolades, and Michelle, for all her presence beside him, were not immune to these dynamics. Their lives, filled with recognition and admiration, also contained cracks that, tragically, widened to the point of disaster. Consider the psychology of such a situation. What drives a family member to turn against those they claim to love most? Is it unresolved anger, jealousy, financial stress, mental health struggles, or some combination of all these factors? Theories abound, and experts weigh in, but the chilling reality remains. The love and trust between parent and child were shattered in a way that seems almost incomprehensible. This is not just a story of murder. It is a story of human relationships stretched to their breaking point, and the terrifying consequences when communication and empathy fail. As we explore the details of that fateful night, the investigation that followed, and the autopsy that revealed the full extent of the tragedy, one question looms larger than all others. Could this have been prevented? Could the signs have been recognized, the warning signals heeded? Friends, family members, and even law enforcement will later recount moments, conversations, and tensions that, in hindsight, were glaring indicators of impending disaster. The pieces of the puzzle are scattered, and as we begin to assemble them, the picture that emerges is both fascinating and horrifying. For fans of the Reiners, this story is not merely sensational, it is deeply personal. It is a confrontation with mortality, with the fragility of family bonds, and with the stark reality that even the most admired and seemingly stable families can harbor dark secrets. And yet, for all the sadness, there is a story to be told, lessons to be learned, and questions that demand exploration. What exactly happened in those final hours? How did the confrontation at the holiday party escalate into a fatal encounter? And what revelations from the autopsy would shock even those who believe they knew the family intimately? This is where our journey begins. Over the course of this story, we will examine every detail, every moment, and every revelation. From the glittering holiday party to the discovery of the bodies, from the autopsy findings to the intricate dynamics of the Reiner family, nothing will be left unexplored. Along the way, we will confront questions of motive, timing, psychology, and human behavior, all while keeping a finger on the pulse of the emotional and dramatic stakes. How do you turn a night meant for laughter, celebration, and togetherness into a scene that haunts an entire family forever? That's the question that no one could answer the night Rob and Michelle Reiner attended Conan O'Brien's annual holiday party. From the outside, the event was exactly what it appeared to be. Hollywood glitter, twinkling lights, festive cheer, and the warm hum of old friends catching up. For most, it was a night to relax, to enjoy, to celebrate the season. But for the Reiners, what should have been ordinary joy masked tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. By the early hours of Sunday morning, those tensions would explode in a way that would leave the world reeling. The party began like any other. Guests arrived in designer attire, drinks in hand, greeting each other with hugs, laughter, and the customary small talk about projects, holidays, and the latest gossip from Hollywood. Rob, known for his affable demeanor and sharp wit, appeared relaxed at first, moving from group to group, cracking jokes, and reminiscing with old friends. Michelle, ever the steady presence beside him, smiled graciously, chatting warmly with those around her. To anyone observing, it seemed like a picture-perfect evening, a successful Hollywood couple enjoying their social circle and style. But beneath the polished surface, subtle signs of unease began to emerge. Family friends who were present later recalled moments of tension, brief but sharp exchanges between Rob, Michelle, and their son Nick. The nature of these exchanges is still shrouded in mystery, but witnesses describe the atmosphere shifting in the blink of an eye. A joke that didn't land, a sarcastic remark that drew a frown, a dismissive tone that sparked irritation. It's the kind of tension anyone who has attended family gatherings can relate to. But in this case, the stakes were far higher. Nick, who was 32 at the time, had always had a complicated relationship with his parents. Some insiders described it as a mixture of admiration, resentment, and unresolved friction. Over the years, those around the family observed that while the Reiners appeared close-knit to the outside world, cracks existed in the dynamics between parent and child. Whether it was disagreements about career paths, financial disputes, or personal grievances, the tension was there, quietly lurking, occasionally flaring up, and now, during this festive night, threatening to boil over. Witnesses recall a heated conversation that began as a disagreement over seemingly trivial matters. The details vary, but the consensus is clear. Words were exchanged, voices were raised, and what started as a private argument quickly escalated to something that could not easily be contained. It wasn't a public fight with the entire party watching, but the intensity was palpable. Those close enough could feel the tension crackling through the air. The Reiners, normally composed and measured, were visibly agitated. Emotions that had been building for months, or perhaps years, finally found their outlet. Some friends later described the moment as a turning point in the evening. Rob, typically calm under pressure, appeared frustrated and tense, his humor tinged with sarcasm. Michelle, usually warm and diplomatic, seemed visibly upset, her patience stretched thin. And Nick, for his part, was described as defensive, argumentative, and increasingly volatile. Observers noted how quickly the conversation spiraled, the words becoming sharper, the voices rising. Even within the cheerful chaos of a holiday party, those close to the family could see that something had shifted, a storm was brewing that no one could control. What makes this night so critical to understanding the tragedy is that it was the last time anyone saw Rob and Michelle alive in a public setting. By the time the party wound down, the tension had not dissipated. If anything, it had intensified. The couple left the gathering in a state of visible distress, their usually calm composure replaced by unease. Neighbors and staff who would later recount events noticed a change in their demeanor, subtle but unmistakable. The shadow of conflict lingered, a foreboding sense of what was to come. To contextualize this, think about your own family gatherings. The moments when small disagreements flare into arguments, when old resentments surface, and the room becomes charged with emotion. Now imagine that tension magnified, accelerated, and infused with unresolved psychological pressure. In the case of the Reiners, the argument at the party was not an isolated incident. It was a culmination of years of complex family dynamics, unspoken frustrations, and volatile interactions. The seeds of tragedy had been planted long before anyone could have anticipated. Even after leaving the party, the interactions between Rob, Michelle, and Nick did not simply vanish. While the party ended, the conflict followed them home. The hours between leaving the social gathering and the discovery of the bodies are critical to understanding the sequence of events that led to the tragedy. Investigators would later piece together a timeline showing that the family returned to their Brentwood estate in the early hours of Sunday morning. It was there, within the privacy of their own home, that the simmering tensions escalated into a confrontation that turned fatal. And yet, despite all this, there were moments when the situation appeared almost mundane, almost normal. Friends who interacted with the family after the party noticed fleeting moments of light conversation, casual smiles, and brief attempts at reconciliation. It's a chilling reminder of how quickly appearances can deceive. What may seem like normal interaction can mask deep-seated turmoil. A family on the brink of catastrophe without anyone outside realizing it. The night of the holiday party serves as a window into the larger narrative of the Reiner family tragedy. It illustrates the stark contrast between public perception and private reality, the tension between appearances and the darker undercurrents of human relationships. It reminds us that even families who seem perfect on the surface can harbor conflicts with devastating consequences. It sets the stage for everything that followed. The discovery of the bodies, the shocking details of the autopsy, and the questions about motive, timing, and psychological factors that would grip the public imagination. And just as the party ended, leaving behind laughter and cheer for the other guests, the Reiners' home became the stage for a tragedy that no one could have foreseen. The events of that night were a precursor, a warning signal whose meaning would only be fully understood in the hours that followed. Friends, neighbors, and investigators would later reflect on that evening, retracing each step, each word, each tense exchange, trying to make sense of how a celebration turned into a nightmare. What happens when tensions within a family explode into violence? How can words spoken in anger escalate into irreversible tragedy? For the Reiner family, the answer came in a way that shocked everyone who thought they knew them. While the previous chapter introduced the simmering tensions at Conan O'Brien's holiday party, this chapter dives deeper into the confrontation that would ultimately set the stage for a catastrophic outcome. The argument between Rob, Michelle, and their son Nick that friends later described as explosive, uncharacteristic, and deeply unsettling. The fight, according to witnesses, did not occur in isolation. It was the culmination of long-standing issues, unresolved resentments, and the emotional pressures of family life. Friends who had known the Reiners for years described Nick as someone whose relationship with his parents was complicated. Intense love mixed with moments of defiance, bouts of frustration, and occasionally, volatility. While the family maintained a public image of unity and warmth, those closest to them knew that beneath the surface, unresolved conflicts often lurked, quietly waiting for a spark. That spark came at the holiday party. Eyewitnesses described the argument as starting over seemingly minor issues. One source recounted that a casual conversation about future plans or career decisions quickly escalated when Rob expressed disappointment in his son's choices. Nick, according to witnesses, responded defensively, his tone sharp and his body language tense. Michelle attempted to mediate, her voice calm but firm, urging both men to step back and avoid confrontation. But in the heat of the moment, words became weapons, and the conversation spiraled beyond control. Imagine being in that room, the lights twinkling, laughter in the background, the hum of other party guests carrying on, and yet, in one corner, a family is unraveling in real time. Voices rise. Accusations are made. Old grievances are resurrected. What starts as a disagreement over minor decisions transforms into a full-scale emotional battle. According to friends, Rob's tone shifted from frustration to exasperation, and Michelle's attempts to de-escalate only seemed to fuel the tension. Nick's defensiveness turned into outright anger, and the exchange, brief as it may have seemed to outsiders, left an emotional scar on everyone present. The party attendees later described the confrontation as different from normal family disagreements. While arguments between parents and adult children are common, this one had a sharp edge, a sense that something deeper, something more volatile, was being exposed. One longtime family friend described it as watching a pressure cooker reach its limit. You could feel it in the air. There was this tension that didn't belong to the party. It was like watching something you know is going to break, but you don't know when or how. What makes this fight particularly alarming is that it wasn't just verbal. Witnesses noted aggressive gestures, slammed doors, and heightened body language that suggested the argument had the potential to spill over into physical conflict. Though no physical altercation occurred at the party itself, the intensity of the verbal exchange foreshadowed the events that would follow. For those present, it was a warning sign, one that in hindsight seems tragically predictive. Friends and colleagues later spoke about the underlying issues that may have fueled the confrontation. Some mentioned financial tensions, disagreements about personal choices, and the pressures of being in a family constantly under public scrutiny. Others alluded to more personal dynamics, feelings of neglect, unresolved childhood grievances, and moments of perceived betrayal. The combination of these factors created a volatile environment, a tinderbox waiting for a single spark. That spark appeared in the form of the argument at the holiday party, a conflict that, while brief in duration, was intense in emotional impact. Michelle's role during the argument is particularly noteworthy. Friends described her as attempting to maintain calm and mediate, striving to protect both Rob and Nick from escalating the conflict further. Her calm demeanor and rational attempts, however, were met with resistance. Tensions had reached a point where reason was almost impossible to impose. The emotional stakes were too high, the unresolved issues too deep, and the volatility of human emotion too unpredictable. In trying to de-escalate, Michelle was confronting forces she could not control, forces that would ultimately have tragic consequences. After the confrontation, the Reiners left the party visibly shaken. Observers noted a change in demeanor, subtle but unmistakable. Rob appeared tense, his usual humor replaced by frustration and concern. Michelle's calm veneer was cracked, revealing the emotional toll of the exchange. Nick's defensiveness and agitation were apparent to anyone paying close attention. The family returned to their Brentwood estate carrying the weight of unresolved conflict, unaware that the hours ahead would transform tension into tragedy. It's important to understand that family conflicts, even intense ones, rarely escalate to homicide. But in this case, multiple factors converged. The pressure of living in the public eye, the long-standing personal and emotional tensions, and the events of that night created a volatile cocktail. Experts later suggested that while the argument at the party was the immediate trigger, it was only the latest manifestation of deeper, unresolved issues within the Reiner household. The seeds of tragedy had been sown over years, and this confrontation merely accelerated an inevitable collapse. In the hours following the party, the family returned home, and according to investigators, the conflict continued behind closed doors. This is where the timeline becomes crucial. While the public saw only the festive party, private interactions in the Reiner home escalated in intensity. The argument's emotional residue lingered, creating an environment of high stress and volatility. It was within this environment that the tragic sequence of events unfolded. A sequence that would leave two beloved individuals dead and a family irrevocably changed. Friends who spoke to investigators after the tragedy expressed disbelief. "It didn't make sense," one said. "Rob was always so calm, so measured. Michelle was the glue that held everyone together. Seeing them at that party, arguing with Nick like that, it was shocking. None of us could have imagined it would end like this." The emotional weight of the argument, combined with years of unresolved tension, created a situation that no intervention could prevent. It was a collision of personality, circumstance, and unresolved emotional conflict. A perfect storm with devastating consequences. And as the night progressed into early Sunday morning, the stage was set. The argument that began at the party was only the beginning, the first domino in a chain of events that would culminate in one of the most shocking tragedies in recent Hollywood history. Friends, neighbors, and investigators would later retrace the steps of that night, trying to pinpoint exactly when words became action, when tension became violence, and how a moment of conflict escalated into irreversible catastrophe. The moment a family's world shatters often comes in silence. For Romy Reiner, it came in the most horrifying, unthinkable way. A quiet Sunday morning, a house that once symbolized safety and warmth, and a scene so unimaginable that it would haunt her for the rest of her life. The discovery of her parents' bodies is a moment that no one could have prepared for, and it's a moment that would shock not just the family, but the entire world. Romy had spent the previous night like any other daughter might. Resting after a busy week, perhaps checking in briefly on her parents, and expecting a typical morning. But as she approached the Brentwood estate, something felt different. Perhaps it was the stillness in the air, the unusual quiet of the usually lively home, or a subtle sense that something was off. Those moments of instinct, of unease, are often dismissed, yet they can signal the presence of danger. For Romy, that instinct would save nothing, yet mark the beginning of a new reality. She entered the home, likely expecting the familiar comfort of family life. The smell of morning coffee, the warmth of voices, the mundane reassurance of presence. Instead, she was confronted with a scene of chaos and horror. Her parents lay lifeless. Rob, 78, and Michelle, 70, had been brutally attacked. The official autopsy would later describe the cause of death as multiple sharp force injuries, a clinical phrase that fails to capture the brutality and finality of the act. Their throats had been slit, stab wounds marked their bodies, and the life that had filled the house was gone. It's difficult to imagine the psychological shock of discovering such a scene. The initial reaction is disbelief. Your mind struggles to reconcile the reality before you with what you know to be true. Grief, horror, and paralysis intertwine. Friends and neighbors, when later recounting similar experiences or analogous situations, often describe an almost surreal sensation, as if time slows and the world becomes unrecognizable. For Romy, that reality was immediate, inescapable, and utterly devastating. Emergency services were called, their arrival only confirming what Romy had already witnessed. Detectives and paramedics, trained to confront death and violence, stepped into a scene that would test even their experience. The neighborhood, once serene and quiet, buzzed with tension as word of the discovery spread. For the community, the shock was twofold: the brutality of the act itself and the fact that it had occurred in a home synonymous with success, stability, and public admiration. Investigators later reconstructed the scene, noting every detail: the positioning of the bodies, signs of struggle, and the evidence left behind. Each piece told a story, but one that was incomplete without understanding the dynamics that led to the tragedy. The home, previously a space of family interaction and shared memories, had transformed into a crime scene, a stark reminder of how fragile the barrier between safety and danger can be. It is critical to grasp the emotional weight of this discovery. Romy's experience mirrors the universal fear of losing parents, yet magnified by violence and suddenness. Many daughters and sons imagine a world where they gradually say goodbye to their parents, in hospitals, through illness, or at old age. Rarely do we imagine confronting them in such a horrific and intimate context. The psychological trauma inflicted on Romy would reverberate through her life, shaping her grief, her memories, and her perception of family forever. At the same time, the discovery immediately raised questions. When did this happen? How could it have occurred in a house that was both secure and familiar? What role did Nick play, given the earlier confrontation at the holiday party? Each question was laden with fear, guilt, and disbelief, and investigators knew that answering them required painstaking work. Timeline reconstruction, forensic analysis, witness interviews, every detail mattered. For fans and the public, the discovery sent shockwaves. Rob Reiner, known for his achievements in Hollywood as a director, actor, and storyteller, had contributed to some of the most iconic films in modern cinema. Michelle, his partner in life, had been a constant presence beside him, and together they symbolized stability, love, and achievement. To see that their lives ended in such violence defied logic and expectation. The stark contrast between their public personas and the private horror emphasized the unpredictability of life and the hidden struggles within families, even those admired by millions. Autopsy reports, when later revealed, confirmed the violence in clinical terms: multiple sharp force injuries, a clear homicide. But beyond these words lies the human reality: pain, fear, and the brutality of the final moments. These injuries, inflicted with intent and precision, indicated more than a fleeting act of rage. They suggested a level of premeditation or emotional intensity that investigators would analyze carefully. Each wound was a clue, each detail a piece of a larger, grim puzzle. Friends and neighbors later spoke about their disbelief. How could such a tragedy occur in a neighborhood known for its calm and security? How could a family that appeared loving and successful harbor the kind of tension and conflict that led to such violence? Their reflections highlighted a chilling truth: domestic tragedy can strike anyone, regardless of social status, wealth, or public perception. The Reiners' deaths were not just a sensational story. They were a stark reminder of human vulnerability and the destructive potential of unresolved family conflict. For investigators, the discovery of the bodies was only the beginning. The challenge lay not just in understanding how Rob and Michelle had died, but why, and what role, if any, their son Nick had played. Early reports indicated that Nick had been involved in the argument hours earlier, but connecting that moment to the ultimate act required careful examination of timelines, communications, and behavioral patterns. Every detail mattered. The sequence of movements, interactions with staff, phone records, and witness statements. Yet, even as investigators began piecing together the evidence, the human story remained at the forefront. Romy's trauma, the grief of extended family, and the shock of friends underscored the deeply emotional stakes. This was not merely a criminal investigation. It was a human tragedy, one that exposed the vulnerabilities, conflicts, and tensions that can exist behind the closed doors of even the most seemingly perfect families. As the day unfolded and word spread, the world began to absorb the horror of the scene. Social media buzzed with shock and condolences, fans speculated about motives, and Hollywood colleagues struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the violent reality of his death. Every account, every piece of information, only deepened the sense of disbelief. How could the Reiners, icons of stability and success, meet such a violent end? But while the discovery of the bodies was the pivotal moment, it was only the beginning. For investigators, for Romy, and for the public, the questions that followed were as important as the facts themselves. What had triggered the violence? How did the events of the holiday party contribute? And most crucially, what did the autopsy reveal about the final moments of Rob and Michelle's lives? Yumet, a list of injuries, causes, and medical terminology. But in this case, the autopsy of Rob and Michelle Reiner would shock the world. It wasn't just the confirmation of death, it was the revelation of brutality, precision, and the sequence of events that painted a chilling picture of their final moments. When the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner's report came back, the official cause of death for both Rob and Michelle was listed as multiple sharp force injuries. A clinical phrase, cold, detached. But behind those words lay the grim reality of a violent end, one that left fans, friends, and family reeling. The autopsy provided a level of detail that no eyewitness could offer. It revealed the type of wounds, the order in which they were inflicted, and insights into the struggle that preceded the fatal blows. According to the report, both Rob and Michelle suffered multiple stab wounds, with some indicating a defensive posture, hands raised, arms attempting to shield themselves, a futile effort to ward off the assault. The throat injuries, particularly, were telling, precise, fatal, and inflicted with deliberate intent. These were not random attacks, but targeted, aggressive, and methodical strikes that suggested an attacker acting with intensity and emotional force. Beyond the obvious, the autopsy also provided timelines. Investigators could approximate when the attacks occurred, aligning the findings with witness reports and security footage. The timing confirmed suspicions. The deaths occurred in the early hours of Sunday morning, mere hours after the explosive confrontation at Conan O'Brien's holiday party. This connection between the argument and the fatal act began to paint a horrifying causal chain. Words exchanged at a social gathering escalating into a lethal encounter at home. For forensic experts, the autopsy also raised questions about intent and state of mind. The nature of the wounds, the concentration of attacks in critical areas, and the distribution of injuries suggested more than impulsive violence. There was a level of focus, a method to the actions, that indicated deep emotional involvement, rage, frustration, or perhaps even a desire to assert control in a family relationship that had long been strained. Every stab wound, every cut, became a clue in understanding not just what happened, but why it happened. Equally chilling were the subtle details revealed during the examination. Defensive wounds indicated that Rob and Michelle tried to protect themselves, yet the sheer number and placement of injuries showed that their efforts were tragically insufficient. There were indications of close-range strikes, suggesting that the attack was personal, intimate, and deliberate. These weren't just physical assaults. They were acts of intense emotional violence, leaving no doubt that the perpetrator had targeted them directly. For fans, the autopsy findings were almost impossible to digest. Rob Reiner, the man whose films had brought laughter and empathy to millions, and Michelle, his steadfast partner in life, had been subjected to a level of violence that seemed incomprehensible. The contrast between their public personas and the private horror of their deaths created a jarring dissonance. It forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about family conflict, human emotion, and the fragility of life behind closed doors. Moreover, the autopsy revealed differences in the nature of each parent's injuries that raised additional questions. While both suffered fatal wounds, the distribution and type suggested variations in the sequence of events, potentially indicating a struggle, moments of confrontation, and perhaps attempts at intervention or defense. These nuances would become critical for investigators as they piece together the timeline and the dynamics of the final hours. In addition to the physical injuries, the autopsy hinted at psychological dimensions. The nature of the attacks, combined with the context of the prior argument with Nick, suggested a deeply emotional undercurrent. Forensic pathologists sometimes infer behavioral insights from patterns of injury, and in this case, the report implied intense emotional involvement from the attacker. The level of force, the targeting of specific areas, and the timing all pointed toward an attack motivated not just by anger, but by a profound and personal emotional catalyst. Friends, family members, and close associates reacted with disbelief as the details emerged. Some struggled to reconcile the man they knew. The filmmaker, the father, the husband, with the brutal reality of the autopsy. Michelle, known for her warmth and composure, had faced a violent and deliberate end that seemed antithetical to the life she had lived. For Romy and the other children, the autopsy provided answers in one sense, but deepened the emotional complexity. Confirmation of death, yet also insight into the magnitude of violence their parents endured. The public reaction mirrored the shock and disbelief of those closest to the family. Social media erupted with speculation, condolences, and confusion. Commentators and journalists attempted to reconcile the clinical details with the human narrative, trying to understand how such a tragic event could unfold in a household perceived as stable and loving. Each new piece of information heightened the curiosity gap. How did this argument escalate so violently? What was the role of Nick in these final hours? Could anyone have foreseen the outcome? What makes the autopsy particularly significant is that it also allowed investigators to connect dots that were otherwise invisible. Combined with witness testimony, security footage, and phone records, the forensic evidence helped reconstruct the timeline, sequence of events, and possible motivations. The report's details were not just a record of death. They were a roadmap for understanding the complex interplay of family dynamics, emotional intensity, and the final tragic act. And yet, even with the autopsy complete, questions remained. Why did the confrontation escalate to this extent? Could interventions have prevented the tragedy? How could a family, outwardly stable and admired, unravel so completely in a single night? Experts in psychology, criminology, and family dynamics would later weigh in, highlighting the convergence of stress, unresolved conflict, and emotional instability as factors that can lead to extreme outcomes. But for the Reiners, these were questions that came too late. As shocking as the autopsy was, it was only the beginning of revelations. Investigators and the public alike were left piecing together the final hours, looking for patterns, clues, and insights. Every detail mattered. Every nuance of injury was a potential window into understanding the tragedy. The report confirmed death, clarified method, and suggested motive, but it also intensified the mystery, leaving observers desperate to know the full story behind the violent act. And just as the medical examiner closed the report, the implications began to ripple outward, through the family, the neighborhood, and the world of Hollywood. The autopsy had provided the facts, but it had also ignited a new set of questions that demanded answers. How do you reconstruct a tragedy that unfolds in mere hours, but leaves consequences that last a lifetime? For the Reiner family, investigators faced the daunting task of piecing together the final hours leading to the deaths of Rob and Michelle. Every minute mattered, every movement, every interaction. Because somewhere within those hours lay the crucial clues that could explain how a family argument at a festive holiday party escalated into a fatal encounter at home. The timeline begins late Saturday night, immediately following the events at Conan O'Brien's holiday party. Witnesses confirmed that Rob and Michelle left the party in a tense state, the glow of festive cheer replaced by visible frustration and concern. Nick had also been present, and multiple sources indicated that the argument earlier in the evening had left emotions running high. The family returned to their Brentwood estate, a space they had occupied for years, a sanctuary that would soon become the scene of unimaginable violence. Investigators established that the attack occurred in the early hours of Sunday morning, likely between 1 o'clock and 3 a.m. A window of time corroborated by security footage, neighbor accounts, and forensic evidence. Within this brief span, the couple was fatally assaulted, leaving Romy to discover the aftermath later that morning. But the challenge lay in understanding what transpired within those hours. How did the tension from the party carry into the home? What interactions escalated beyond control? And what role did Nick play during that critical period? According to law enforcement sources, the couple's return home was marked by unease. Rob and Michelle were reportedly still discussing the argument, their voices tense, their patience worn thin. Nick, according to preliminary reports, remained defensive, his earlier frustration unresolved. Investigators believe that the confrontation continued in private, away from any prying eyes, a closed-door escalation of the conflict witnessed hours earlier. It's a pattern often seen in domestic tragedies. What begins as a verbal dispute in a public or semi-public space continues and intensifies in isolation, where unchecked emotions can spiral into violence. Forensic evidence later provided additional insight into the sequence of events. The distribution of injuries, defensive wounds, and positioning of the bodies suggested that a struggle occurred over a period of time. Rob may have attempted to intervene or shield Michelle. Michelle's injuries suggested attempts to fend off the attacker. Every detail of the autopsy and the crime scene reconstruction helped fill in the gaps of that early morning timeline. Neighbors also contributed to the timeline, recalling unusual noises or the absence of expected activity. While the neighborhood was typically quiet, some reported hearing raised voices or signs of distress during the early hours. These accounts, when cross-referenced with security systems and cell phone activity, helped pinpoint the critical window in which the fatal assault occurred. Each observation, no matter how minor, was a crucial piece of the puzzle. Phone records became another key element in reconstructing the timeline. Investigators analyzed call logs, messages, and timestamps to establish who was present when communications occurred and whether any attempts to seek help were made. While some calls were innocuous, others raised questions about interactions between family members in those hours. Were there warnings, disputes, or pleas for intervention that went unheeded? The records suggested a complex interplay of attempts to manage conflict and moments when escalation became unavoidable. The timeline also sheds light on the psychological environment during those hours. Stress, fear, and emotional intensity can distort perception and decision-making. Rob and Michelle, attempting to navigate an escalating conflict with their adult son, were operating under extreme emotional pressure. Nick, likewise, may have been influenced by a combination of frustration, resentment, and unaddressed mental health factors. In high-stakes domestic conflicts, minutes can feel like hours, and each decision, each word, can shift the trajectory toward disaster. By mapping these final hours, investigators could begin to reconstruct not just what happened, but why it happened. Every step taken by the family, every interaction, every movement through the house was analyzed for clues. Where did the struggle begin? Did Rob or Michelle attempt to escape or call for help? Were there interventions that might have prevented escalation? Each answer helped create a clearer picture, yet simultaneously deepened the sense of tragedy. These were ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, navigating a domestic conflict that no one could anticipate would end in death. Public reaction to the timeline was immediate and intense. Fans, who had followed Rob Reiner's career for decades, struggled to reconcile the details of a meticulously reconstructed timeline with the man they knew on screen. Michelle, remembered for her warmth and composure, had faced her final hours in a struggle that few could comprehend. The timeline, clinical in its precision, nevertheless carried immense emotional weight, underscoring how quickly ordinary events can transform into irreversible tragedy. What also emerges from examining the timeline is the stark contrast between perception and reality. To the outside world, the Reiners were simply a family returning from a holiday party, living in a calm, secure neighborhood. Behind closed doors, however, the dynamics were charged, volatile, and ultimately fatal. The gap between public image and private reality is a theme that runs throughout domestic tragedies, And the Reiner case is a harrowing example of how that disconnect can manifest in the most devastating ways. And as investigators continued to refine the timeline, questions began to arise about interventions that could have altered the outcome. Could family friends, neighbors, or security staff have recognized warning signs? Were there moments when escalation might have been interrupted? Each question highlighted the difficulty of predicting human behavior under extreme emotional strain. The tragic inevitability of the hours that followed was not obvious in real time. Yet hindsight reveals a series of critical points where intervention might have prevented the outcome, points that now serve as haunting reminders of human vulnerability. The final hours of the Reiners' lives are a study in escalation, human psychology, and the fragile boundaries between argument and violence. Every interaction, every choice, every word contributed to the outcome. Investigators piecing together the timeline were not just analyzing events. They were reconstructing a human story of tension, conflict, and tragedy, one that forced the world to confront the terrifying reality of domestic violence within even the most admired families. And just as the early hours of Sunday came to a devastating conclusion, the next phase of the investigation would focus on the person at the center of it all, Nick Reiner, and the evidence that would eventually connect him to the horrific events. In every family tragedy, there is often one figure whose actions dominate the narrative, whose presence cannot be ignored, and whose decisions may hold the key to understanding the unthinkable. In the Reiner case, that figure is Nick Reiner. The events of that fateful night, the argument at Conan O'Brien's holiday party, and the brutal deaths of Rob and Michelle all converge around him. For friends, family, and investigators, understanding Nick's role became central, not only in determining what happened, but in grasping the emotional and psychological dynamics that led to this catastrophe. Nick, 32 at the time, had a complicated and often strained relationship with his parents. Those close to the family described moments of closeness and affection, but they also spoke of tension, disagreements, and resentment. What exactly fueled this conflict is still being explored, but multiple sources indicate that disagreements over lifestyle choices, financial matters, and personal autonomy had long been sources of friction. On the night of the party, those tensions boiled over into the explosive argument witnessed by friends. But to understand the full context, investigators and psychologists would later examine years of interactions, noting patterns that hinted at underlying emotional volatility. Eyewitnesses at the holiday party described Nick as defensive and increasingly agitated. His responses to his parents' comments were sharp, sometimes cutting, and he appeared unwilling, or perhaps unable, to de-escalate the confrontation. While Rob and Michelle attempted, in their own ways, to maintain composure, Nick's heightened emotional state created a combustible environment. For those observing, it was clear that the argument was different from ordinary family disagreements. It carried an intensity that suggested deeper issues were at play. After leaving the party, the tension did not dissipate. According to investigators, the argument likely continued as the family returned to their Brentwood estate. This private escalation set the stage for the events that would follow. Forensic evidence, including the distribution of injuries and defensive wounds, would later indicate that the confrontation at home became physical and ultimately fatal. It is here that Nick's actions become central to the narrative. What may have begun as anger, frustration, or emotional volatility tragically escalated into lethal violence. Friends and acquaintances have painted a picture of Nick as a complex individual. On one hand, he was described as caring and capable of affection, a son who had moments of genuine connection with his parents. On the other, he exhibited signs of volatility, defensiveness, and unresolved conflict. In the context of the Reiners' family dynamics, this combination of traits created a situation ripe for escalation. Experts suggest that familial expectations, emotional pressure, and underlying psychological factors can converge in moments of crisis, transforming words into actions in a frighteningly rapid sequence. Investigators later noted that Nick's presence in the hours between the party and the discovery of the bodies was critical. Security footage, phone records, and witness statements helped piece together his movements, interactions, and behaviors. Every detail was scrutinized. Did he attempt to reconcile? Did he retreat or confront? Was there a moment where the trajectory could have been altered? These questions became the backbone of the investigation, as law enforcement sought to understand not just what happened, but why it happened. The involvement of Nick also sparked intense emotional reactions within the family. Romy and the other children were forced to reconcile the image of their brother as a family member with the horrifying reality of the night. Emotions ranged from disbelief to grief to confusion, as the family grappled with a tragedy that blurred the lines between love and violence. Psychologists note that such reactions are common in cases of intra-family violence. The shock is compounded by the betrayal inherent in an attack perpetrated by a loved one. Public perception, too, was profoundly affected. Fans who had admired Rob Reiner for decades struggled to comprehend how someone they recognized as a family man and director of beloved films could have a son involved in such a violent incident. The story became not just a criminal investigation, but a social and psychological case study. The intersection of familial conflict, emotional intensity, and tragic outcomes. In Hollywood and beyond, the Reiner story sparked discussions about family dynamics, mental health, and the hidden struggles that can exist behind closed doors. Experts analyzing Nick's potential motives point to a combination of factors: emotional intensity, unresolved resentment, and the prior confrontation at the holiday party created a volatile mix. Some speculate that long-standing disagreements reached a breaking point, and that Nick's actions were the result of a momentary loss of control compounded by deep-seated issues. Others emphasize the need to consider mental health and psychological stressors, suggesting that underlying conditions may have influenced his behavior. Regardless of the exact cause, the tragic outcome underscores the unpredictable nature of human emotion when conflict escalates unchecked. It is also important to recognize the legal implications of Nick's involvement. His actions, and the subsequent investigation, would determine not only criminal responsibility, but also the broader narrative surrounding the Reiner family tragedy. Law enforcement and prosecutors would examine his behavior, the sequence of events, and the evidence from the scene to establish accountability. For the public, this aspect of the story introduced an additional layer of intrigue and concern. Could a son be legally and morally responsible for such an extreme act against his own parents? Despite the gravity of the situation, investigators emphasize that understanding Nick's role requires a nuanced perspective. This is not simply a story of evil or malice. It is a complex interplay of personality, family dynamics, and emotional escalation. Experts in family psychology note that intra-family violence often arises from patterns of tension, miscommunication, and unresolved conflict, magnified in moments of stress or provocation. In the Reiner case, the events of the holiday party, the private escalation at home, and the eventual fatal outcome illustrate this pattern with tragic clarity. Friends, colleagues, and community members who knew the Reiners continue to grapple with the reality of Nick's involvement. Statements range from shock to sorrow to disbelief. Many emphasize that no one could have predicted that a family gathering, an argument, or even a moment of anger would culminate in the loss of two lives. The tension between public perception and private reality remains central. On the surface, a family celebrated and admired. Behind closed doors, conflict escalated to lethal proportions. And as investigators continue to examine Nick's actions, motivations, and state of mind during those critical hours, the next pieces of the puzzle emerge: witness statements, behavioral patterns, and subtle details that shed light on the final sequence of events. Understanding Nick's role is not just about assigning responsibility. It is about unraveling the chain of decisions and emotional reactions that led to a tragedy no one could have foreseen. In the wake of a tragedy, the voices of those who witnessed, knew, or were near the events often provide the most human perspective. For the Reiners, friends, neighbors, and party attendees became crucial storytellers, piecing together moments that official reports and forensic evidence alone could not fully convey. Their accounts paint a portrait of tension, foreboding, and subtle warning signs, while also humanizing a family suddenly thrust into an unthinkable crisis. Immediately following the discovery of Rob and Michelle's bodies, neighbors described a sense of shock that rippled through the Brentwood community. This is a neighborhood known for its tranquility, where quiet streets and manicured lawns suggest a life removed from chaos. Yet, on that Sunday morning, the quiet was broken not just by the arrival of emergency responders, but by whispers, speculation, and disbelief. Residents spoke of the Reiners as private, polite, and seemingly typical. A family the neighborhood admired. Many were stunned to learn that violence of this magnitude had occurred within such a familiar and secure environment. Friends who had attended Conan O'Brien's holiday party offered additional insights. Several witnesses described the argument between Rob, Michelle, and Nick as unusually intense. "I've known the family for years," one attendee said, "and I've never seen them like this." The tension was palpable. You could feel it in the air. It wasn't just a disagreement. It felt like something deeper, something dangerous. Others corroborated this, noting the rapid escalation of voices, the defensive body language, and the emotional intensity that marked the confrontation. Some partygoers expressed regret and guilt, reflecting on whether they could have intervened. In retrospect, they recognized the warning signs, sharp words, a tense tone, and gestures of frustration. But at the time, they assumed it was a normal family spat, perhaps to be resolved in private. This phenomenon, familiar to psychologists and crisis intervention experts, highlights how easily escalation can go unnoticed until it's too late. The Reiners' tragedy underscores the reality that domestic conflicts, even among public figures, can have catastrophic consequences when unchecked. Neighbors provided critical details about the early morning hours. Some recalled unusual sounds: raised voices, a door slamming, brief commotion, although no one fully grasped the significance until the discovery of the bodies. These accounts, minor as they may seem, helped investigators piece together the timeline of events. Every observation, every reported noise, was another piece of the puzzle, confirming that something extraordinary and tragic had occurred inside what had been considered a safe and private home. Close friends of the family added a more personal dimension. They spoke of the Reiners' long history together, their decades of partnership, and their role as parents. "They were a loving couple," one friend said. "They had disagreements like any family, but you never imagined it would escalate to this." These reflections highlight the stark contrast between public perception and private reality, a recurring theme throughout the investigation. To outsiders, the Reiners embodied stability and success. Behind closed doors, tension, conflict, and emotional volatility simmered beneath the surface. Witnesses also shed light on the dynamics between Nick and his parents. Several attendees at the holiday party noted that Nick appeared increasingly defensive and agitated during the argument, suggesting a buildup of long-standing tension. Others remarked on his body language, crossed arms, rigid posture, and gestures that conveyed frustration and resistance. These seemingly small details became crucial in understanding the trajectory from argument to lethal confrontation. Psychologists later emphasized that such escalation is rarely sudden. It is typically the result of a series of stressors, conflicts, and emotional triggers. In the Reiners' case, witnesses' observations support this assessment. The family had experienced years of unresolved disputes, varying expectations, and generational tensions. The party confrontation, as described by multiple sources, acted as a catalyst, amplifying existing emotional pressures into a critical moment that ultimately led to tragedy. Even those not present at the party contributed to the narrative. How staff, neighbors, and close acquaintances provided insight into the family's routine, emotional climate, and interpersonal dynamics. Some noted subtle changes in behavior in the days leading up to the event. Tense conversations, unusual arguments, and brief, uncharacteristic outbursts from Nick. These accounts, when combined with eyewitness testimony, autopsy results, and forensic evidence, helped create a multidimensional understanding of the events that unfolded. Media coverage amplified these personal accounts, broadcasting details and speculation to a global audience. Friends and neighbors, while speaking out, often struggled with the public attention, balancing grief with the pressure of recounting painful events. Yet their perspectives were invaluable, offering context that forensic reports alone could never provide: the human element, the emotional depth, and the relational nuances that shaped the tragedy. Some witnesses also reflected on the aftermath, describing the emotional shockwaves that affected everyone connected to the Reiners. Even those of us who weren't in the house felt it, a neighbor said. It changed the entire community. You couldn't walk down the street without thinking about what happened. It was impossible to ignore. Their words highlight the ripple effect of domestic tragedy, illustrating how violence within a family can impact not only those directly involved, but entire communities. Ultimately, the voices of friends, neighbors, and witnesses serve as both evidence and testimony. They confirm, contextualize, and humanize the events leading up to and following the deaths of Rob and Michelle. Through their accounts, investigators could better understand the timing, escalation, and emotional intensity of the confrontation, while the public gained insight into the hidden realities of a family that had once seemed untouchable. And as the collective recollections unfolded, a more comprehensive picture began to emerge. One that not only detailed what had happened, but also hinted at the deeper, more troubling dynamics that would shape the remainder of the investigation. In the aftermath of a tragedy, it is the investigators who must transform chaos into clarity. For the Reiner case, law enforcement faced a daunting task, piecing together the evidence to determine exactly what happened, how it happened, and who was responsible. Every clue mattered, every observation became a lead, and every inconsistency demanded scrutiny. In cases of familial homicide, the investigation is as much about understanding relationships and motives as it is about the physical evidence. From the moment Romy discovered her parents' bodies, detectives began meticulously documenting the scene.